Welcome, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing today's city conversation, which is about urban green spaces revisited. For those of you who don't know me, I work at the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Association. And the TCPA is a UK-based charity whose vision is homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. And for us, that means places that are green and places that have trees, parks, allotments, green routes and waterways, places that have well-designed and well cared for green infrastructure. As part of my work as Director of Healthier Placemaking at the TCPA, I run the National Green Infrastructure Partnership. It's a network of people and organisations working to promote, protect and improve green infrastructure in the UK. And it's free to join, so I'd really like to encourage you to sign up and you'll get our regular newsletter. There's now a huge amount of evidence that good quality parks, green spaces and street trees have a measurable positive effect on people's mental and physical well-being. And a few years ago, when we spoke about the mental health benefits of green infrastructure, people often looked a bit puzzled. They understood that running around in the park might be good for your physical health, but were puzzled by the mental health benefits. But I think the pandemic lockdowns have changed that dramatically. We all felt the loss of green spaces while we were confined to our homes. And in spring 2021, when people were allowed out and were allowed to go to the park, I think most people really appreciated firsthand how important trees, green spaces, parks, and greenery around people's homes are for everybody's health. And I think we all appreciated as well how incredibly unfair it is that some people have trees and gardens and parks literally on their doorsteps and other people don't. So support for greener urban areas is really growing, but making them happen continues to be really challenging. In many cities and towns across the world, the pressure to build more homes is high for completely understandable reasons, but making that happen is very, very difficult. And often there's huge pressure to build on the green spaces that people have in their neighbourhoods. And recent research showed in England that the new parks and green spaces being created in new developments are far smaller than those created in 20th century developments. So although green roofs and green walls are really important for tackling climate change and increasing biodiversity, and it's really great to see them being encouraged through planning policies, the fact remains that you can't run around in a green wall. We need to have green spaces as well as and including all sorts of other green infrastructure. So in many parts of the world, the challenge is how can we create enough good homes and enough good green infrastructure? But in other places around the world, cities are shrinking, jobs have moved elsewhere, and smaller populations are struggling to work out how to live successfully in places that need less land than they were built with. In places like this, green infrastructure could have a really important role to play for health, for climate resilience, and for local food growing. But how in practice can we shrink cities, grow their green infrastructure, and still create attractive places where people really want to live, places where the green infrastructure is looked after and maintained? So this is sort of what's on my mind at the moment, about the challenges of creating really good places with fantastic green infrastructure. These two developments are about the same age. They're both in England. The one on the left is in the middle of England, and the one on the right is on the edges of London. They were both created at about the same time with the same national planning policies in place, and yet the outcomes are dramatically different. And I'm really interested to know why. And I think it might be a combination of different factors all tangled up together. Something to do with land values. It's easier to get better quality developments in places where there's higher land values. Something to do with political leadership, with politicians who have the courage to turn down developments that aren't good enough, which perhaps doesn't happen often enough. Something to do with skills. not having the right people in the planning departments, the right people employed on the teams creating developments, and something about being able to say what good looks like. We all want good new development, but how can we really specify what good really means? How can we make this happen? So I hope that some of these questions are explored through the conversation that we're about to have. We've got 5 fantastic speakers from very different backgrounds, very different professional backgrounds, based in different countries with different views about these subjects. So I hope that we're going to have a really good conversation. I hope that you, the audience, will also join in. So please post your questions in the chat, and we will try and address as many of them as we can and invite you to join in later in the conversation. So without further ado, moving on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Ben Wheeler. Ben is Associate Professor in Environment, Health and Inequalities at the University of Exeter's European Centre for Environment and Human Health, where he's Centre Co-Director. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks, Lorraine, and everybody for the invite to this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it, and lots of fascinating things for us to talk about, I think. And congrats, Julia, for tackling my extremely long-winded affiliation, which I always have to apologise for. So I'm going to just talk briefly over some ideas around urban green spaces, health and inequalities, and really picking up on several things that Julia has already mentioned in the introduction. So the idea, I guess, here is how can urban green and blue spaces deliver health benefits? And we think about this in terms of our engagement, our exposure to, our experience with nature. And I'm a health geographer, so I tend to study these things in terms of sort of where people live and the nature of the environment that's around them and how we interact with it and how that can impact on our health and well-being. But it really requires a very broad sort of approach to understand how these connections work, because they're really very complicated. We have all these proposed mechanisms. Julia already mentioned physical activity as a key one, but also stress recovery and cognitive restoration, some of the key sort of psychological processes by which we might gain mental health and well-being benefit, but also the benefits of social contact, physical environmental change, such as urban heat mitigation and air pollution mitigation. So there's a really broad range of ways in which our sort of urban green and blue spaces might deliver those health and well-being benefits through a broad range of different kinds of mechanisms. There's obviously much wider environment benefits too, and actually it's really important for us to think about these as perhaps more indirect routes to wider population health benefits through carbon capture and flood mitigation, protection and improvement of biodiversity, soil preservation, oceans protection. So all these different ways in which our urban natural spaces can actually provide this massive range of what we might think of as ecosystem services, and lots of those resulting in human health and well-being benefits. Of course, the evidence around this kind of set of topics has been really booming in the last 10 years or so, but has been around for a really long time before that as well. And this kind of massive evidence has been helping to inform relevant policy and practice, both in the environmental domain, in the public health domain, and in others too. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of these kinds of, this is a bit UK focus here, but internationally as well, with the World Health Organization's work around urban green spaces and health, and other organizations too. But also we have to set this in its wider context, thinking about those linkages between biodiversity and human health and the range of agendas that are tied up in that. Work there done by the Convention on Biological Diversity with WHO, and plenty of other work since then as well. WHO have flagged nature as our greatest source of health and well-being, but also thinking in the global context, as I'm sure we'll discuss today, around the pandemic and how that's really radically changed both how we have interacted with our urban green and blue spaces, but also how we perceive them and how we perceive the value of them for our health and well-being and our relationship with them. So tons of stuff going on that is really important in influencing how these relationships work. I'd also flag up often and we're always guilty of this in our research, we often talk about quantities of green spaces and blue spaces, but obviously quality is really important as well. I just wanted to flag up a really nice project that's going on down here in Cornwall, funded by the European Regional Development Fund, which is primarily a biodiversity improvement programme. So it's taking relatively small green spaces in our towns and cities down here in Cornwall and improving them for the sake of biodiversity, but at the same time looking for these opportunities to support health and well-being, to promote social interaction, to gain those community benefits at the same time as capitalising on the opportunities for biodiversity gain as well. And another example there. And there are plenty of other examples around the UK and around the world of these kinds of programmes happening. I just wanted to mention briefly the importance of kind of integrating our environmental and our social interventions. We have reasonable evidence now that our best bang for our buck comes from mixed interventions. So not only improving and protecting our physical environments and planning them, but coupling that with social, educational, promotional interventions to really make sure we gain these kind of rich, diverse range of benefits for the environment and for our communities. So integrating our approaches across sectors can be a really important part of this. I also wanted to flag up that we need to consider the needs and issues related to particular population groups, whether certain population groups are underserved in terms of urban green spaces, or whether there are particular ways that they can be managed in order to provide those opportunities. We've done some work around young people and adolescents, and particularly their mental health and well-being and the opportunities presented by urban green spaces, but how they're often actually also perceived as problematic. You know, they potentially could benefit really significantly, but actually young people are often sort of viewed as problems, as kind of potentially sources of antisocial behaviour and so on. So really important how we tackle that. And also, like I've mentioned, making sure our evaluations of programmes really consider these multiple outcomes so we can demonstrate the wide range of benefits of what we do. And lastly, just to mention community engagement and involvement. And again, I'm sure many of you are aware of this kind of stuff, but that kind of idea around public participation in green space decision making really helps to make sure that you gain those kind of all those potential benefits, and making sure that the opportunities are there for all members of the community to gain those benefits. So just to wrap up in brief, it's really arguable, I think, that urban green and blue spaces are really a vital component of our livable, healthy cities. They're not just a nice to have luxury for people that can afford it, but it's really valuable to think about integrated environment and social programmes, to think about the complexity of needs and the potential for unintended consequences of what might happen, and also that sort of crucial element of community engagement and involvement. So I'll wrap up there, and I'm really looking forward to discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was a fantastic presentation to get us started. We're going to move on quickly, so there's time for discussion at the end, but do post any questions you've got in the chat. So our next contributor is Professor Anna Jorgensen, who's a landscape architect and a former head of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. And Anna's research interests focus around urban landscape planning and the relationships between urban natural environments and health and well-being. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. My talk follows on very nicely from Ben's, because I've got some examples illustrating some of the points that he made. So I'm going to talk really about the findings from Improving Wellbeing Through Urban Nature, which was a 3-year research project which took Sheffield as a case study and really tried to sort of dig deep and really understand the relationship between natural environments and urban populations in Sheffield. So we used lots of different methods. We did epidemiological studies. We did some quantitative work. We developed an app. We did some cost-benefit analysis. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the results and findings from all of those methods. So echoing Ben, we did find that quality was just as important as quantity and distribution of green space. We particularly found that there are certain landscape and land cover characteristics which are associated with better general health. These are listed here: high proportion of water cover, diversity of trees, less grass, good interspersion between grey and green, and having some large spaces, not all small. And I think those sorts of things are more difficult to retrofit into cities, unless, as Julia said, you're looking at kind of radical urban change, which I think we will probably see, in the coming years, and perhaps not too far away. But there are certainly things that can't be remedied on a site-to-site basis. We also found that green space cleanliness and lack of cleanliness is associated with depression. So this is Sheffield. You can see much higher rates of depression than expected in the west of Sheffield. And you can see here much poorer green space cleanliness and green space maintenance in the west of Sheffield. And we did, a proper analysis. We controlled for all the factors that might be confounding the results, but we found this statistically significant association between lack of cleanliness, lack of good maintenance of green spaces, and depression. And that kind of makes sense, because if you're surrounded by green spaces that are full of fly tipping, not maintained, needles, graffiti, it's probably not going to make you feel very good about the place where you live, and by extension about yourself maybe, and about the people who should be looking after you, or should at least be caring for the places that you live in. We also found a strong relationship between perceived biodiversity and the variety of birds. So there was an indication that people knew when they were in biodiverse spaces. And through the app, we also found a strong relationship between more biodiverse green spaces and more positive emotions. So there's something about biodiversity and incorporating biodiversity into the kind of fabric of urban life. Context and access, very, very important. So we already know that urban populations don't have equal access to natural environments. That can be for very different reasons. So in Sheffield, in Sheffield, as I've already indicated, the west of Sheffield has better general health, better mental health than the east of Sheffield, and that also coincides with much higher levels of deprivation in the east of Sheffield. So if you look at these bar charts here, you can see that at the bottom here we've got levels of deprivation. So we've got lowest level of deprivation here, highest level of deprivation here on the right. So you can see at first glance, it doesn't look like there's a problem, because in Sheffield, you've got more households in more deprived areas living within 300 metres of any publicly accessible green space. So there appears to be lots of publicly accessible green space. But then if you look at this chart here, you can see that where you look at access to large, natural feeling, high quality, publicly accessible green space, that relationship falls away. So what we have in Sheffield, and this is actually quite atypical, is lots of poor quality green space, particularly small patches of green space, nothing interesting, lack of diversity, and also higher density of populations in that eastern part of Sheffield. So as Ben says, you really have to sort of dig deep and understand the complexity of these relationships. So it's not just about having more acreage, it's about that quality and about that relationship with green space. Very interesting, that in Sheffield, around a third of the land cover is private gardens. And we also found a statistically significant relationship between access to a larger garden and better general health. And this was, we controlled things that might be expected to affect general health. And we found the relationship still held good after that. Now, that might mean that we should be building new housing at low density. I'm not sure it necessarily means that, but I would say it certainly means that we should think twice about building housing where people have got no access to some sort of private green space. And I think that's really, really important, especially because there has been a drive in recent years to reduce the size of gardens and even to build houses with bedrooms, or certainly flats with bedrooms with no windows at all in them. Physical infrastructure, very important. It's about the way that people access green spaces, walking and cycling, and particularly toilets and cafes. You know, people need that essential infrastructure. People with children, older people, they have to have access to a toilet if they're going to spend any appreciable length of time in a green space. And there's also something about having something to do, having a destination. Doesn't necessarily have to be a cafe, but there needs to be something happening. There needs to be activation. So that's a point that Ben made. Green infrastructure needs to be social as well. So it's not just enough to have the green space, and it might not even be enough to have the good quality green space. You need those programs, you need that social infrastructure to connect people in. Nearly getting towards the end, there's this thing about cultural differences in green space perception and green space interaction. Very important not to have a kind of normative approach to understanding people's relationship with the natural world and with green spaces. Context is really important. The nature of local populations, experience, previous and potential connections with nature. Very important for green space managers and voluntary and community groups to understand the populations they're working with and working for. And finally, nearly finally, everyday experience is really, really important. So it's not just about those parks and green spaces, those iconic destination places. It's about those little microbursts of exposure to beauty, to reverie, to reflection, to just taking 5 seconds time out in a busy day that actually make a difference. And finally, nearly finally, sorry, I keep saying that, cost-benefit analysis, all of the interventions we looked at paid their way with a surprisingly low number of users. So you can see here, cycling and walking route, cost-effective after only 1,600 users. So it's essential for us to make that shift between sort of firefighting and just thinking about where we are today and dealing with the problems that we've got today. We have to think about, higher up, we have to think about time and how we can protect people against ill health and depression in future by the interventions we invest in now. And just very finally to say that we have a full suite of policy and practice briefs on the I1 website, so do drop in and take a look at them. So I've tried to fit the very short time scale there. I hope that's not been too bad in terms of taking too much time. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And what I take from that presentation, it always strikes me, is the importance of those small, ordinary local spaces, which the planning system so often doesn't protect. But they're hugely important. And for those of you in England today, there was an announcement from government that planning will be changed to take better account of the environment, and it'll be interesting to see what details follow from that. Moving on, our next speaker is Adam Friedberg. Adam leads Bureau Happel's Cities team in the US, which is made up of economists, planners, engineers, and sustainability experts. And he has worked on the first ever Los Angeles county-wide sustainability plan, and New York City's 1.5 degrees climate action plan. So thank you for joining us, and over to you, Adam.
Thank you, everybody, and really, really happy to be here and happy to be on this panel with some great speakers and really interesting content. Funny thing, I'm showing a picture of New York City in the High Line, but just a very important piece of I would consider public infrastructure that was actually supported by non-for-profits originally. But I'm going to really focus today on Detroit and some of the work that we've done in Detroit and what we're seeing in Detroit and seeing a city that really went bankrupt and how they're planning for the future and how important green space is. So you don't have to read this whole thing, but what's the story of Detroit is a fascinating one, and I suggest people read about it. But one industry, one economy focused on the automobile industry. When they got hit pretty hard in the early 2000s, and over time as well as globalization occurred, you got to see a major shrink in the city, where the city basically went bankrupt. And there was an opportunity to plan for how what should be the future of Detroit. And we've been fortunate to work on a number of renewal projects, really even from the birth and the strategic planning projects, and starting to see what's actually happening in the city, and it's pretty amazing. This was actually led by some of my colleagues in London, believe it or not, working on a strategic plan for a major Rust Belt city. As you can see, that part to the right, 1/3, if not more, of the kind of framework plan for the city is focused on green infrastructure, green open space, parks. I can't reiterate how important green is and open space is to any city. We've lived it in the last week. We're discussing it today. We lived it in the last couple of years. But it is an infrastructure. Green open space is infrastructure, and we need to continue to say that. It provides similar services that potable water supply does, similar benefits that energy does. Open space is infrastructure, and we need to have that in the framework of our conversations. And when you do these frameworks, you start with the people and understanding how many, what type, how will we be able to generate revenue. And also our resilience, because any city and numerous cities you've seen over time have fallen for a number of reasons. So how do we plan for a resilient city in the future? And that's everything from the cities, the systems, the population, to the actual fiscal sustainability, to the economic development and the environment that we create to ultimately create a nice quality of life for people. And how do we plan for green infrastructure? How do we plan for that? And I think that, taking an old city with very old infrastructure and finding opportunities to use some vacant properties to basically serve our communities is a critical point. Another great project that's happening right now in Detroit is they're converting a highway system into a boulevard. And granted, it's not the most pedestrian-friendly boulevard, but it's a major grade up from what was. And we're starting to see a lot more of this in cities, these major highways, these pieces of infrastructure that cut through cities, separating communities, and the ability to kind of naturalize it, or in this case, even create a more pedestrian-friendly or just general accessible communities through these types of projects. One important piece too to kind of reframing a city are the big players. Ford has a major foundation in a place like Detroit. Henry Ford, invention of the automobile, and or automobile services, and coming back and using the planning and using the infrastructure to bring people in and create new services. And the mobility district in Corktown is an opportunity to Ford to understand what mobility as a service is, but also just create a better community, better spaces than what I would consider their more isolated plant in Dearborn. And also using technology to save space, where we take so much space with the automobile, and creating opportunities for more pedestrians, more micromobility, and reserving more space for public realm. Another great project is the Joe Lewis Greenway that's currently happening in Detroit right now, and that's basically a connection of all the major neighborhoods through a 32-mile corridor, recreational path, really non-automobile focused, that will connect the greenways and create one path, connect neighborhoods, connect open spaces around it. And this type of model has worked in the U.S. thus far, and in places like Atlanta with the Beltline, and even in New York City with the High Line. But the ability to use open space and create these connections neighborhood to neighborhood to liven up and create economic development out of that. And then, as I mentioned, there's more progressive developers, and we've been working with one in the US called Bedrock, whose main strategic goal is to redevelop these Midwestern urban cores. And a major part of that is taking these, I would say, gray deserts or road, asphalt deserts, pavement deserts, and really greening them up. Creating places that people want to visit and people want to go to. Yes, there's development around it, but as important as the development is actually the public space and the green spaces in these areas, and also having them serve as more of a, like I said, an infrastructure, and have the advantages of stormwater capture, and have the advantages of air pollution reduction, and have the advantages of heat island reduction, and create these models in these areas where it's been, asphalt plazas for the most part, as well as planning for a new major market in Detroit, which has been kind of a stronghold here for many years, but planning green infrastructure around it, working with the community, and I think that's also essential as well. This is a collaborative effort. What's happening in Detroit right now isn't from the top down. It's from the top down and bottom up. You have major community players, you have major non-for-profits, you have the city, you have the private element, as I mentioned, the Fords and the Bedrocks, all coming together to try to create a better place, and diversify businesses, and to create a place where people want to live. And with that, I say plan. It's every kind of bigger project that we work on, it's so important to have that framework plan. And it's even better when those things come to fruition. Not all of it, but a lot of it, to create a better place. A more integrated plan will lead to best outcomes. I think that's we know that, but sometimes we live in our own silos, and we need to work together to make sure we have the best information to provide the best outcomes. A collaborative process is absolutely critical. Working with the community, working with the real estate side, working with the landscape architects, the engineers are all critical. Top down and bottom up, as I mentioned. This is not going to be led completely by the top down, especially for more community services. We need to make sure that the stakeholders involved, they're the ones that are going to occupy these spaces at some point. And as I mentioned earlier, green space is infrastructure. We should be using that more and more, making sure everybody uses that term. Green space is 100% infrastructure, and it should be the same conversation as transport, as energy, as water, as waste. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was fascinating, and I'm sure people will have lots and lots of questions about it. So just to remind you all, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and draw more of you into the conversation towards the end of the presentations. So our next contributor is Nanko Dolman. Nanko works on water resilient cities at Royal Haskoning DHB. He has an MSc in civil engineering and is also a landscape architect. And he has, between 2011 and 2016, Nanko was a part-time lecturer in water management at the Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. And just to remind you, full biographies of the speakers will be on the City Conversations website for you to look at later. So Nanko, welcome to the conversation, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Also to to contribute to this conversation, and I will let's say continue the various perspectives and experience on green infrastructure and the importance of green spaces in urban areas. And I will give a little bit more background on the experience in the Netherlands, although we also work globally in international projects. And I will tell that also a little bit from the water lens. So the combination of blue-green, but also hybrid infrastructure and like blue, green, and gray. I will start with I think for me, very inspiring start or a proposition. And it's to see cities in its natural land as part of the natural landscape instead of having an urban landscape. And that is the Ecopolis model or the Ecocity Model. And that was developed by one of my professors in Delft. He did his PhD on this in 1996. And one of the best examples in the Netherlands, I think, is Amsterdam. And that is the bottom right picture that actually shows graphical representation of Amsterdam as a lobe city, wherein the green wedges infiltrate the city. And also connections are made. So the nature is really meeting the citizen in a way. And it is also about linking the ecology to sociology. And it is also to be very to consider yourself or we as humans as part of the urban ecosystem. And that is in 3 parts. So it is about the participating city, the management of actors, so the interest, organizing, making decisions on land use. It is about living city, sustainable urban areas, like we saw already, about livelihood and dealing with heat stress, health of people. And it's about responsibility. It's about ecological attuned lifestyle, the nexus of energy, waste, water, traffic, etc. This also brought into the discussion in the late 90s on spatial planning and design in the Netherlands that we would approach cities as part of the landscape, the soil, and therefore a layer approach or an approach in layers was introduced. And I think everybody already knows this. And to see the substratum, like, okay, there's the underground, the soil, and what we have, there's also part of our ecology. It's about networks. That could be natural networks, nature-based, but also added or hard infrastructure, gray networks. And of course, the occupation, how we use the land. Later on, we also looked at water. And the Netherlands, of course, is a country of water management, partly below the sea level. And we looked at why not can be cities considered as self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and looking at cities as sponges instead of having only, and that is what we used in the US while working in New Orleans after Katrina, paved by pump. Why not introduce and consider water and to treat it like delaced or drain only when necessary. And this was also part of what we called the multi-layered safety approach. And that is, of course, basic or reactive on the flood risk management in having flood defenses and flood prevention. Of course, that could be, or it's mostly infrastructure, partly could be green as well. But then when there is a flooding occurring, it's also about spatial adaptation. It's about how we use and how we design our urban areas or landscape while there is flooding and we want to control it. Why not? Nature or green spaces can also mitigate floodings. And then finally, of course, there is the calamity or the response layer. And this is actually my sort of own approach in the sense of already in the application or in the introduction, I was introduced as both engineer and as designer. And this was a framework we proposed and helped us working after the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, because first the response was building back all the levees and the barriers. Also in the Netherlands, we have a tradition, of course, in having multi-layer safety. But what about the interior of the dikes and within, with our cities, our agricultural, our nature? And this is about land use. So it is about combination, merging design and engineering in that way, and see what are the values that can be used. So we can come with the what we call the 4-quadrant approach. And 2 quadrants are more on the design. So that is the typologies, the land use, because challenges and opportunities could be different. It's about system analysis, landscape approach. It's about quantifying, modeling. That is more the engineering part. We want to make calculations on water levels, or we want to calculate on heat stress. And there is the what we call the ecosystem metrics. That is the bottom left. That is a sort of, it could be like a table. And this is the metrics because we have a sort of array or toolbox of all the different kinds of green infrastructure solutions, but they will fit a certain landscape or certain typology and have a performance relating to, for instance, health or to heat stress or maybe floodings. And we try to calculate or monetize that. And I will conclude with some examples in the Netherlands. So one is Rotterdam. And Rotterdam is in a transition from a delta city to a garden city today. And a few years ago, they announced a 233 million euro investment on having 8 or 9 new green spaces. So there's a big jump. And we're working now together with the Weather Wise program, that's the climate adaptation program, to merge those both budgets to accelerate climate adaptation in Rotterdam. This is Zwolle, and Zwolle is more in the river basin or catchment area, higher in the Netherlands. And interesting is that last year the railway development also invested a lot in green spaces and combined that with, because you have a lot of people traveling, traffic going through, people with bicycles. We actually have a bicycle garage underneath, and you can have green spaces along the way going under the pavements and storing your bike. And this is also the storage area when there is a flooding. And of course, this is part of a bigger green network. And finally, and that's, I think, the sort of micro scale, very close to people and also to our living, let's say, level. And this is actually my hometown in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And we have turned all the bus stops in, so we call them B stops now, but they all have an eco roof. And of course, you can imagine that this is about, I think, over 400 of them. And it never costed any investment to the local city council because it was part of, let's say, the manage or the maintenance of those bus stops. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nanko. That was fantastic. Lots of food for thought there, which I'm sure we'll come back to. So do continue to post your questions in the chat at the bottom, and we'll share them later on. Our final speaker is Dr. Ian Mell. Ian is a reader in environmental and landscape planning at the University of Manchester, and his teaching and research focuses on green infrastructure planning in the UK and internationally. And he's also been part of the team working with the DEFRA Natural England project to develop the Green Infrastructure Standards framework. So welcome, Ian, and over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to the invitation to come, and thank you to everyone for coming this afternoon. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and I forgot how to use PowerPoint now, sorry. And talk a little bit more about policy and how that might shape some of these things. And I'd just start with COVID. And COVID's that dirty word we're supposed to have all forgotten about now because it's gone. But I think what it really did, it made a lot of people consider what they value in terms of their family, in terms of their friends, their jobs, but also their environment. And for 2 years, 2 glorious years, we had everyone thinking the landscape was the best thing in the world. It was the place that we all wanted to go out to. We had fights with other people for being in the park when it's our park and so on. Now that we're sort of hopefully transitioning out of that, I think we have to consider whether or not that mentality of what value green spaces and what value parks and trees and all the other forms of green infrastructure have, whether that will be maintained. And it's been interesting to see Anna's work from the IWEN project about how that those sort of that continuation of engagement and understanding seems to be quite prominent in Sheffield. And I think one of the reasons why we need to consider why and how people are placing value on the landscape is partly because we need to understand better about access, about equity, about quality versus quantity and functionality, but also because in the UK in particular, we have a history of policy which is almost boom and bust. We have really good environmental landscape green policy, a lot of it coming through New Labour. There are critiques, but it's better than maybe other times. National planning policy framework in England, we might all have a different opinion. This always pains me to say, but the 25-year environment plan, I think, is actually really good. And then we move towards planning for the future and sort of digitisation. Then we move to now the Environment Act. And I think within all this, we could probably argue that there's been a massive variation in the way in which landscape and particularly green space has been located within these documents. And what this kind of suggests to me is that different governments, as we would see all around the world, and you might look at Detroit, as we've already spoken about, or New York, and see where that acceptance that green spaces are good for our cities might actually have a very shaky history in terms of, are we talking about the economy, are we talking about housing or transport, and the fact that, as Julia alluded to at the start, we can't really run around a green wall, so is green infrastructure always going to be a really good thing? But I think one thing that we're starting to see now is that the GEI and particularly green spaces are being considered more along the lines of being essential infrastructure, as being part of that very immediate and baseline conversation of the things that we need to talk about along with housing and transport and economic development, rather than the thing that we used to do afterwards. And I think that is a significant change because of events like this, because of academics, because of the environment sector, and a lot of developers are really trying to get on board of these ideas. So I think where we're actually going to is a slightly different shape in terms of the role of potentially green space policy. Yes, we always need high-level policy at a national level to set an agenda, but we could probably question whether or not that's the most relevant or appropriate location to actually deliver on some of these ideas. So are we now looking more about going back to the regions, and maybe not to regional spatial strategies, but thinking about how they might have a more prominent role in delivering better quality green space management over a broader set of areas? Are we looking at individual cities or local planning authorities, or maybe even public-private companies like the London Legacy Development Corporation? And I think what's interesting about these is that all of these different locations, and you could point at London in particular, have prioritised green spaces, part of their broader thinking around livability. And I think coming back to COVID again, that access to green infrastructure or green space or water resources was really key when you looked at the density and the composition of a lot of the older neighbourhoods in London, where you might have a central park which might have been taken over by car parking. Therefore, where did people go for their walk, or where did they take their kids out? And so I think what we are seeing within this broader conversation is a far more directed discussion around the value of green space to individuals, to communities, and to society. And I think that last bit is often overlooked when you talk to central government, because they might have different priorities. And I think part of this conversation is the growing discussion, for better or for worse, around metrics which look to give us a really solid, robust evidence base for why we need green space. And some of that might be around Ben's work with Becca Lovell around the quantification and the qualification of health benefits. We might also be looking at biodiversity net gain and how that might actually deliver that additional 10% in biodiversity on site. Or it might be things like the National GI Standard coming through, which is looking at both qualitative and quantitative metrics, or urban greening factors, or building with nature, as an example of somebody who tries to deliver quality without compromising on livability. I think a couple more things just to think about is potentially the role of devolution or the latest planning reforms. The Queen's speech, again, spoke about the levelling up agenda and regeneration. So is there a place for green space to be brought back to the fore through regeneration objectives, such as the community forests? Started in 91, still doing a really important job in the northwest of England, in Yorkshire, and around the southeast as well. And so I think there are some core challenges that we need to think about. And this quality-quantity argument is never going to go away. Do we need more green space, or do we need better green space? Do we need accessible for all or accessible for some? Do we need high functioning and diverse, or do we need something which is appropriate for a particular location? And I would say we need all those things. That's green space should be big enough for the people who want to use it, diverse enough for the people who want to use it, accessible and equitable for all those who want to use it. And that's really difficult, because that challenges us as planners, as landscape professionals, as environmental professionals, to think about our disciplinary ideas, our silos that we work in, and the way in which we present ideas and what we're willing to do or what we're willing to compromise on. We need to think geographically about the location, but also how we translate ideas from the Netherlands, from Detroit, from Sheffield, into a more effective form of landscape planning. And of course, we need to think about money. We've had 12 years of austerity in the UK. We seem to be in a worse place. So there's questions there about that. But I think by having these reflective conversations with ourselves and our colleagues, I think we can start to understand how we can deliver better places that are more livable, more functional, and more sustainable. So I don't necessarily think we need to revisit green spaces. More, we just need to reprioritize or reset our thinking about how we address issues of quality, and that we should be delivering high quality in all instances. And therefore, building with nature, therefore, biodiversity net gain should hopefully go some way to doing that. We should be prioritizing access and equitability. So how can we get developers of apartment blocks or high density areas to actually think about the public realm more effectively and integrate trees and water and biodiversity in there? And how do we think about what people actually need? It's always really nice to hear when people have spoken to and got the ideas of local communities and they've delivered on that, because invariably they are the people who know best. And invariably they're the people who are widely ignored by central government. So I think when we can do what people want now and in the future, when we can think about this quality and quantity balance, I think we can actually create far more livable and places for the long term, places for the future that actually we've had before. We have precedent, we have history, we have a lineage, but we seem to forget it every 10 years or so and have to then reinvent the wheel. So I'll stop there, but I think these challenges are not insurmountable. I just think that we have to be directed and innovative in the way in which we address them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I found that quite hopeful for the future as well. So that was a great place to end all of our contributions on. So we've now got a number of comments and questions from the audience, and some interesting points here. So I wonder if now that all the speakers have heard what each other have to say, I wonder if I could just put a couple of comments to you. So there's something about radical urban change that has been mentioned. And is it time to be a bit more radical and to stop thinking about piecemeal changes to the environment? We all know lots of lovely little examples of things that have been really good. But looking at what Nanko was showing us, looking at what's happening in Detroit, this is quite big, radical stuff. Do you think that in the UK we need to be a bit more radical? And I wonder whether any of our speakers would like to comment on that? We're being a bit timid here. Ian?
I think we can and we should. Maybe we haven't quite hit rock bottom yet, because normally in Detroit, the boom came after there wasn't much anywhere else to go. The community forest came when there wasn't many places to go in the northeast of England, so it was do something or it gets worse. So maybe the UK is not quite as bad as we all think it is at the moment, and there's still some down to go. But I think being radical and sort of almost sticking two fingers up to people and say, no, we're going to try this, and it might fail. And if it fails, we'll try something else, and we'll try, and something will work, because as an industry, we are incredibly innovative, and we all have lots of really cool ideas, and we know they can work. We just need to be able to do them and be able to test them, really.
Right. Any other of the speakers like to comment on that? Should we be more radical, make bigger changes?
I think we should. I think it'd be great to have leaders, local authority leaders or regional leaders who are really prepared to stick their neck out and come up with some really, amazing flagship projects related to green space. And I think there are opportunities. There are opportunities in the sort of post-carbon economy. There are opportunities to think about strategic retreat from floodplains rather than building on them. Driverless cars, I've heard it said that they present an opportunity, that driverless cars may lead to fewer cars on the road. So I think, definitely there are opportunities. And Sheffield has historically has shown leadership in this area. We've got Greater Green, which is over a kilometre of what was a dual carriageway, which is now a kind of greened walkway and sort of reduced car lane. But I think we can go much further than that. And it's a real struggle for local authorities to find the finance. We need leadership at all levels.
Great, thank you. And I don't know whether the person who posted that question, Pretty Parika, whether you would like to add anything to the thoughts about being radical, or whether you think the speakers have said it all. Welcome.
Thank you. So I think there were 2 points. One about being radical, but that also means kind of implementing or constituting changes at scale. So you're not just talking about a park, we're talking about looking at rivers and drainage paths at a larger scale, whether it's a city or a catchment area. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to add more on radical cluster scale.
May I add some to this? Yes, the bigger scale. So today in the Netherlands, we are sort of debating, let's say, the whole country scale. And especially when looking 100 years, 200 years ahead. And it's quite sort of challenging, also very difficult for decision makers, because they're sort of looking forward 4 years or maybe 10 years. And the Dutch Delta program is looking at 2050. But we have to sort of anticipate, especially because our country is almost half below sea level. We have to anticipate on the sea level rise, for instance. And one of the scenarios, or more scenarios, is working with nature. So that is a bigger scale nature-based solutions. We already have room for the river, giving back land to nature, but also using sedimentation in the coast to create new land. But that costs, or that will take generations to develop. But eventually that will create a natural flood defense. But that's the radical change that is now debated, of course, and is interesting for designers. And it is, but I'm not sure whether that is already taken up within the political decision making.
Thank you both for that. One of the tensions, I suppose, is that sometimes big projects can be unhelpful. So big iconic projects can be perhaps a bit show-offy rather than functional. And is there a tension between those big projects and the ordinary spaces that Anna spoke about so eloquently? The ordinary places are very important for people. Nicholas Falk, you put some interesting comments about that in the chat. Would you like to add to your thoughts?
Okay, well, thanks so much. I feel that we need big ideas and small projects, whereas what we tend to get is big projects with small ideas. The Thames Tunnel or sewer will be an example of that in comparison, say, with what Bazalgette did with the original sewer. And it seems to me that the tendency of the way we hand out money, either depending on developers or government largesse, encourages this focus on a few iconic projects, which do little to improve well-being of the mass of people. So my suggestion would be that given the limited amount of resources at the moment, instead of just simply measuring everything to extinction, almost paralysis by analysis, we should start by identifying key routes that people take. You can use the disciplines of space syntax or other forms of geodesign in order to concentrate improvements in ways that will be most visible. And that would be my first proposal. Secondly, to link that to a way of raising finance, which means not only tapping or sharing in the uplift in land values from development, as has happened visibly in King's Cross, for example, but also reforming property taxation so that the people who benefit from a better life, which includes those who have the most property, are paying a much higher charge. And that's got to go to local bodies who've got to be trusted. So we have to have a mechanism, not by encouraging a kind of free-for-all, as right-wing theorists might argue, but rather a mechanism that can build consensus gradually, as I say, starting in the most visible places, and not just giving prizes to the sort of big schemes that are photographed and get into the magazines, but the little things that make all the difference. I'll just give you one instance, if I may. If you put plants around a tree, providing they're the right kind of plants, then you show that people care. You see this on a big scale if you go around Rieselfeld in Freiburg, but you can see it in some instances in London where shops have perhaps taken care of trees. And if we could treat this and get back the spirit we had with new towns and development corporations, and have what I would call renewed town corporations or renewed town alliances, we can produce a critical mass of change. I think above all, and I don't think we need the results of climate change, what may be happening or visible in the Netherlands, to get us to act today. We have to just show that it's possible to restore hope, to make people feel better if they see a better world outside. And so, Julia, I absolutely agree with focusing on the small, but turning those into big ideas that will excite enough people to put the resources in to both plant the trees and to water them and to maintain them.
Thank you very much. And given that you've now raised the thorny question of how we pay for maintaining green infrastructure, I'd like to ask Adam what's going to happen in Detroit, because I can see how you can create a lot of green infrastructure there, but who's going to look after it? Who's going to pay to maintain it?
Whenever I get that question, I always say, what's wrong with creating new jobs, right? And to me, these are long-term sustainable jobs. Somebody's going to have to maintain these systems. It starts with the Parks Department, and it starts with the DPWs, the Department of Public Works, and they're typically used to maintaining, in some cases not maintaining, but they should be maintaining, stormwater infrastructure, and why and how they're going to maintain this new infrastructure. So it's a pretty complex process, but no different than any other new job. It involves training. You need to have the funding to do the training. And then you need to have the people that are interested in basically maintaining this new green infrastructure. In some cases, on the private side, it's an open discussion. If it was at one point city land, then you leave that to parks, and you get basically an arrangement with the parks department in terms of who will be maintaining the space. Otherwise, it's done. We've worked with on the private side with where they basically maintain these spaces, this green infrastructure themselves as part of their development deal. So I think that it's, to me, it really rolls down to the big thing. It's like, what's wrong with creating good new jobs? And I think that's the part that I think sometimes is missed. I understand the budgetary aspects, but to me, if you're creating this new infrastructure, you don't need as much of the people basically maintaining that old infrastructure. And then it's just a bit of training. And there is foundational support from the large foundations to provide training for this type of skill set. I just want to briefly comment on what was discussed earlier, and I think that it's absolutely important, and especially when you work in the built environment, you work on these large development projects, you see these patches of green spaces being created because they're kind of required as developers to do that, and it's not integrated, right? And you just think of the lost opportunity that we could create this massive green space if all these developers, or even there was a city policy in place, a mechanism in place to allow them to basically pay for and fund a much larger, more useful, much more beneficial green space, as opposed to let's say, the small percentage connected to their site that will be, so some people will be even skeptical get on because they don't know if it's public or not. So I think we need to do a lot more at the city planning level and include those mechanisms to allow for much more productive green spaces.
Great, thank you very much. And I think many of us would have seen really awful examples of green spaces that have clearly just been lines on a map that a developer's drawn, completely regardless of how it might function as a useful green space for the people who are going to move there. I'd like to bring in Sue James at this point. Sue's asked an interesting question about whether universities are practicing what they preach in terms of looking after their green spaces. So, Ben, can we bring you in at this point? Is the University of Exeter doing what it could for its green spaces? And perhaps Sue can ask others as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess just thinking about, universities do own a lot of estates, but also, as does here in the UK, the National Health Service and other sorts of large corporate bodies that own very large tracts of land and actually have the potential to be influential. So I guess that question doesn't only relate to the universities themselves, but to those wider questions. And I think here at Exeter, I think we're pretty good at it. I think we have 4 campuses. The one that I'm on is on a hospital site, so it's not under our control. But the other 3 campuses, I'm pretty sure, I think all 3 of them have Green Flag Awards for the estates. And certainly 2 of the campuses are based on large parkland sort of old estates, basically. So I think it is a sort of a thing that the university can be proud of, and I think other universities are much the same. And we're trying to kind of make these connections, I guess, with a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So I've got colleagues who've got a large program of work around supporting student mental health, which has been really, really problematic for the last couple of years, and anybody who knows students or work with students will be fully aware of that, I'm sure. And I think just joining the dots seems to be really important here, and I think this picks up on a lot of the conversations that we've already had here, really. I think capitalizing on where these links are, demonstrating how this kind of green infrastructure can be massively beneficial and should be treated as critical infrastructure just as much as roads, as power lines, as whatever else. And I think that positioning then helps the financial sustainability, because it's not like, oh, it's just a nice to have, and well, we're short of money, so we can cut the Parks Department funding by another 80%. And that those kind of things then become very different conversations once you've made these kind of relationships much more fundamental to our collective kind of well-being in its broadest sense.
Sue, does that encourage you?
Yes, it does. I mean,
posing of the question was partly because, universities are teaching people to deliver these things, so are they demonstrating it? And with universities, hospitals everywhere, we're saying take more exercise, do this, do that. Are these the places where we can best lead by example? And then that informs what we do in other sort of parts of our urban environment. We prove they work, demonstrate we're doing it, show how to cost it, show how to maintain it. And then you sort of have won the case when you're taking it beyond those areas where you've got sort of more ownership control of what you do there.
I don't know whether any of the other academics on the team here would like to comment about their universities. Ian, how's your university doing for green space provision?
There are a couple of my students here and they've heard my thoughts on this. So I think universities more generally could do better. I think as big civic institutions, we have a major role to play in our cities. And I don't just mean Manchester, I mean other ones. We don't necessarily do enough. We have the knowledge, we have the capacity, we have the outreach, we have the will, we have the innovation. But I think we can be a little bit, or we can be forced to be siloed by the structures of the institutions and where we work and the need to publish or to get money, but not necessarily to spend that time cultivating some of those relationships. And I think within every university, there are academics who have those long 15, 20-year relationships and they're pushing, but the people at the top may not have the same goals or ambitions. We at Manchester have quite lofty ambitions for social responsibilities, for being greener, but there potentially might be a disconnect between some of those things and the operational way in which we teach or research or just move students around the campus. So I think universities, along with the emergency services, along with councils, along with other big civic institutions, all have a massive role to play. And I think potentially we've all waited for somebody else to take the lead and then maybe thought, oh, we can do this now. Because when I worked in Liverpool, I said the football clubs, it's an easy win. They pay for all the parks, for all the football pitches. They get a legacy. But it was always, they already do community outreach work. So that people didn't want to force them or push them. So I think we could do more. I think we're doing good stuff, but maybe it's not as visible or meaningful to many people who aren't in our sector, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. And I've posted in the chat a link to a consultation that the Department for Health and Social Care is doing about mental health in England. And there's a great opportunity to respond to that and say how important green infrastructure is for people's mental health. One of the things we've been talking about throughout the conversation is that green infrastructure should be considered as vital, essential national infrastructure in the same way that roads and communications infrastructure is considered. And I'd like to ask Namco whether in the Netherlands that's the case, because of the enormous focus that you have on water management. Does that mean that green infrastructure is considered essential infrastructure, or is it still a battle to get it to be seen as important?
In many cases, is it still a battle? Yes. Although because of the land use, especially to limit subsidence and to the flood risk, we are sort of focused on draining, discharging, high water level protection, and this is also the sort of the water management is sort of following, serving to the land use, intensively used for agricultural, but also the enormous urbanization pressure on the western part of the Netherlands. So everyone, strangely enough, wants to live in the lowest part of the Netherlands. But there is, I think the past 10, 15 years, there's become a more and more attention again to green spaces. And also to combine it with, because we already have a network blue, and it is considered like a sort of ecosystem. Why not combine it with, so like the blue ribbons with the green grid? So they're looking at some cities are taking the lead, like Rotterdam, because of their enormous investments, but also in jumping forward and broader. Amsterdam, of course, in competition with Rotterdam. So there's also a competition going on in cities. And another very interesting example is the city of Arnhem. They announced to depave. So there are battles in the Netherlands about depaving. So they will. So for every tile or a paver you depave, that will be awarded, and the city who does the most of them is the winner. So every year there's a competition, and of course communities. So the normal people who live in the cities, they can contribute and will offer free service in let's say in advice for having small gardens at their houses, or depave their gardens, because partly cities are also privately owned. That was already said, 1/3, maybe half of cities. So we need those private properties also for connecting the dots, or connecting all those little pieces of green into a more bigger network.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put a question to Anna. We've had Sue has mentioned in the chat about whether we should have a certain amount of green space per person. And given that your research has been so much about how people experience very local green space, do you think there's merit to that? Would that help if there had to be a certain amount of green space per head of population?
I think it's a useful yardstick to have, because I think it's a kind of, a rough and ready measure of how well a city is doing in terms of providing levels of green space for people. There is the World, I quickly Googled this, the World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 9 meter squares, which is virtually nothing per capita, but an ideal amount of 50 meter squares per capita. But I think it's very contextually dependent, because you can live somewhere like the Barbican, which, there probably is quite limited. I don't know London very well anymore, but, probably quite limited green space around the Barbican, although there's some nice kind of planted areas. But, you're probably very wealthy, and you probably got the wherewithal to jump on a train and go somewhere. Or fly somewhere or drive somewhere. So, your sense of kind of crisis and needing to get out and be in a green space may be much less, because you've got those opportunities. So I think we have to look at the context of places, and we have to understand the needs of local populations. So I'm not sure that having a kind of an algorithm would solve the problem. I think we need to be more creative, more flexible, more nuanced than that. And we have to really spend the money where the money is needed.
Great, thank you. And yes, thinking about places where homes are very overcrowded and people really need to get out and have a space on their own. It's very different from homes where people have gardens and aren't overcrowded.
Absolutely.
Can I just come in on that quickly, Julia? I just think I sort of agree with Anna's kind of hesitancy about it, to the extent that I would say, actually, I think those kind of figures aren't really useful for us. And I think they can provide something to hide behind and a bit of a lowest common denominator to aim at. And actually, I think there's the sort of the more complex sorts of sets of metrics that have been proposed in things like the London Plan. I think Natural England had them for a long time, about living X distance from a green space of this size or whatever. And I think those things, they're just really difficult to then pass out into thinking about the equity side of things and thinking about how is it actually distributed across the people in our cities, in our different neighbourhoods, especially when we start rounding it all up and averaging it into a total global sort of figure. Because actually a lot of our cities are incredibly green, really. When we look at the sort of percentage of land cover that is green in lots of cities, it's surprisingly high. and actually those figures then sort of start to make things look really, really rosy when often they're really not. And when we look at the sort of the actual spatial distribution and the social distribution, it's actually much worse than it really looks. So I think sometimes those things can be, present more challenges than they solve.
Great.
I'd just like
Thank
to add
you.
that that hits.
Yes, please come in.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, it does. Yeah, it happens all the time, and you can see, a few years later what happened, and what happened is, generally speaking, the more wealthy areas, get the most, I would call it, infrastructure compared to green infrastructure in this case, compared to the poorer areas that might need it. And so, like, going back, in terms of the mechanism and the criteria used, I think for some of these targets, let's call it that, or even policies, need to be a lot better. Overlaying it with maybe some resilience measures, and looking at the communities that are impacted significantly by heat, and prioritizing the I would say more difficult potential areas to plan, but will create more value to the community around it. I think is a very important thing to do.
Great, thank you. We're coming towards the end of the conversation, and it's great that it's been so rich and varied. We've got another question which I'd like to put to all of you for a fairly brief response. So, Andrew, you have a question about planning being reactive. Would you like to put that to the panel, and then perhaps people could comment make that comment on your question, their final contribution?
Sure. Well, I think without having any good in-depth knowledge of the topic, I have a sort of nostalgia for the sort of central planning that we had of cities and London plans after the war, which were very much about bringing in the green spaces and how the city worked with us on the big level that some people have been talking about. But after the 1980s and the sort of whole change in the way we looked at the public sector, I have a nostalgia also for those sort of wonderful mavericks, who sort of visionary mavericks, and I think of people like Cedric Price and Will Alsop, for example, who had these inspired big visions that would stir us up. So, but now I think we're rather sort of victim of this passive, reactive planning system, which means that okay, you can do things like Detroit. You have to do something because you can't leave it as it is. But I think in perhaps the UK and other European economies, we need something more. And I just wonder whether the panel feel that we've got enough vision to really pursue green space at the moment, or whether it needs some more integrative design vision to make it happen.
Great, thank you. That's been a bit of a theme, hasn't it? Big visions versus small actions. So I'll go around you quickly. Nanko, any thoughts? Big visions or small actions?
Yes, I like it very much. It's also like looking at it in historical, present, and future perspective. I think because we're sort of looking now at examples from, let's say, developed countries, cities, and because we have so heavily invested in all those infrastructure, it could, let's say, cause a sort of lock-in, because we have to maintain all those. And I think that's maybe a little bit the barrier to be more creative and to be more coming with maybe more radical solutions. I'm working also globally and also for development banks in developing cities. And there the possibilities are, of course, more open. And I think we have to sort of reinvent it, maybe. Looking at maybe to look more at the nature, and maybe to sort of say, okay, integration is really hard. It is about working as a whole government, of a whole organization, a whole network, instead of having all the separate domains.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're fast running out of time. So any quick comments? Anna, a final comment from you.
I think we need bottom up and top down. I don't think it's one size fits all. Sheffield, again, it was completely decimated by transport orientated planning post-war Sheffield, and it's taken years to reverse that. But in a way, in some sort of perverse way, I find that kind of post-war transport-orientated planning inspiring, because there was a vision and there was a real belief in the future, and people thought they were making things better. Unfortunately, they weren't. But I think, we need that kind of vision and courage still. I know it's really hard in such a highly populated country, but we need to try harder, I think.
Great, thank you. Ian, a final comment from you?
I think central government are reluctant to be proactive and move away from the economy towards the environment. I think at the local level, there's reticence in local planning authorities to not do what they're told by central government in case they lose their funding. But I think at the local level, there's massive amounts of vision and expertise and drive to push these things through. And I think planning officers in particular get a lot of sticks and beatings for doing things really well, when actually they're the ones making those good things happen. So, and I think they're being proactive and they're thinking long term, and they're working the margins with their elected officials to make it happen when elected officials aren't necessarily on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yes. And Adam, final thought from you.
Just simply put, we experienced the last 2 years why open space, why these green spaces are important. We need to constantly remind people. It's not just about, the quantification. The quantification is getting better. It's the somebody said earlier, the qualification, the qualities. And we qualified that people were moving out of places like New York City because they wanted more access to green space. Mm-hmm. They wanted more space. So to me, as practitioners, as professors teaching students, we have to constantly remind our policymakers, our with our votes potentially, and whatever we can do to tell people why this is important, why we want this. It's not just going to be led by them.
Thank you. And Ben, a final thought from you as we wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. These are all great questions and discussions, and everybody's already said this really, but to my mind, a lot of this is politics, right? And public health is incredibly political, as is planning, and inevitably, therefore, a bit reactive and a bit short-termist and opportunistic, whereas the questions we're talking about require long-term, large-scale vision and view, and there's just a massive disconnect there. So that presents us with some challenges, but we have to find the opportunities where we can get them. And, you get a fantastic city with a great local authority running it, prepared to do radical things. Let's support that and make it happen where it can work. Great.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers for a really fascinating conversation. And thank you to the Happold Foundation and Ingenuity for organising the conversation as well. And finally, thank you very much to all of you in the audience for your really good questions and contributions.
And can I also thank you, Julia, for stepping in and chairing that? I think that was wonderful, the way you brought us all together and led us through the topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.